A Charis Equip a webinar. You remember 2020? You probably want to forget it. You may have lost loved ones. You probably had division in your church, and you learned how to use this thing called Zoom. And there were parts of it that were kind of cool. You could connect with people. This is a picture of me and my family connecting, probably for a holiday or a birthday, because we were encouraged to stay apart and stay within your bubble. So that's me and my family on one side. And then if you look over at the other screen, I took a screenshot of me during my doctoral project. I was in my second year studying discipleship at Talbot. And during that time, we had to meet online for a week's worth of classes. And my professor was innovative and creative, but nothing takes the space of meeting in person. And so trying to meet for 2 weeks and talk about embodied discipleship while being in a Zoom space was really frustrating. But we did what we could. And then there were things that our fellowship was doing in 2020. There were a couple times during 2020 that we as a fellowship were able to spend some time in Zoom spaces talking through how people were managing COVID. We talked about how people were managing issues of race and some division in our church. And those were really good opportunities. And I just pause here to point out you can't really see close up all the different people who are represented in this picture here, but we have a couple people in this Zoom space who were leaders in our churches who have since passed away. Most recently, Vicki Reif, right there in the center from my church at Leesburg Grace. We just had a wonderful memorial service for her yesterday, but continue to pray for her family. And I'm so thankful for her. She was a woman who was committed to making disciples, who made disciples. My family was personally blessed by her disciple making efforts. And then just below her, Greg Howell, who passed away in a couple years prior to Vicki. So these pictures are memories of how we got together. They also remind us that we are part of a family of churches and a network of leaders who are committed to doing Jesus's work of making disciples. And when we couldn't be in the same building together, we at least found spaces to meet. So I know Zoom has its strengths. And as I was thinking about ways that we can keep the idea of disciple making or leadership development in front of our churches, I thought, well, we could do a couple of these Charis conversations again. But what I'm calling these over the next year is Charis Equip Webinars. So this is the first of 4 Charis Equip webinars that we're going to be doing. As the Fellowship Council has been meeting, we've been talking about our commitment to common mission. And we are saying that as part of our global family of churches, we want to make sure that church planting, leadership, training, or development and doing good is at the core of what we're pursuing as Charis Fellowship churches. And so as a Charis Fellowship, and Charis Fellowship Council over the last year, we've said our focus really wants to be on leadership development and healthy churches. And so as we go about this year and we look at conference focus retreats and then these Charis Equip webinars, we really want to focus in on church health and on leadership development. And to me, Discipleship Pathways is this wonderful sweet spot because Discipleship Pathways help develop leaders. But if you're not developing disciples at your church, you're probably not healthy either. So if you want a healthy church, you're doing discipleship. And so this is the first of our 4 Charis Equip webinars. This one is focusing on discipleship pathways, and it's this sweet spot between healthy churches and leadership development. A week ago, I was listening to a podcast interview. It was one guy who likes to get in trouble a lot, Rick Warren, and he was talking to Carey Nieuwhof on the Carey Nieuwhof podcast. And this was the headline of this interview. He said, 99% of churches don't have a discipleship plan. And that obviously grabbed a hold of me. It was the headline, and then he talked about it a little bit. And then he talked about the 16 movements of Jesus that you read about in the Gospels. Jesus had a deliberate plan to develop disciples. And then he talked about how throughout his ministry, he's developed a deliberate plan to keep raising the stakes for people who follow Jesus. Now, I can tell you, as I've had a chance over the last year to talk with different leaders of our Charis Fellowship churches, that I think we're doing better than 1% with a plan to develop disciples. So this is a massive overstatement, but I bet all of us in this space, or anyone who watches this video after the fact, would say, is my discipleship plan as strong as it could be? And the answer would be probably not. There's always room to grow. We're always in development. And so I'm hoping through this Charis Equip webinar, you'll get an opportunity to hear about what some different leaders in our Charis Fellowship churches have been doing to create a discipleship pathway and how we can learn from each other. I realized that you could go to so many different webinars. You could probably even ask ChatGPT to come up with a discipleship pathway plan for your church, and it would probably do an okay job. But I want to suggest that when we do stuff as Charis for Charis, the particular flavor can be really, really good for us, maybe even more helpful than what we would just find online. So what I've done is I've had conversations, I've done some research, I've done some reading on what some of our Charis leaders are doing for developing discipleship pathways, and that's what I'm presenting to you today. What is a discipleship pathway? It's worth giving a shared definition. So here's a shared definition. It's a plan designed and directed by church leaders to help their people grow in maturity and ministry as they follow Jesus together. That's a discipleship pathway. It's designed and directed by the leaders. So that's probably the people in this space today. What are we trying to do? Help people grow in ministry and maturity. I was talking to one of our leaders, and he was saying, yeah, I could probably just take someone else's discipleship plan and adapt it, and that would be good enough. But he wanted to take his own leadership team, his elders and leadership team through this. And he thought it was very beneficial to go through that process with them. And so I talked with pastors, I talked with discipleship directors, I looked at some of their material. What we're going to present today is a culmination of conversations, documents, and teachings from about 8 different churches in our fellowship. Maybe not the best representation of our fellowship because we have 230 churches and we have people right now who are watching this who are in different parts of the world, even doing different kinds of ministry. But I'm guessing that those 8 churches do represent some really good ideas as it relates to discipleship pathways. So let me just give you a couple of caveats that I heard from the get-go. Everybody I talked to said our pathway is a work in progress. So anything I present to you today, or if you follow up with any of these leaders, they will be humble enough to admit we don't have it perfected. We're constantly fine-tuning it. Or for some, it's even something that they're working out right now, and they'll probably make a 2.0 or 3.0 version. Our pathway is a work in progress. That was a common caveat. I also had one pastor I mentioned already, Reg Overstreet here locally from where I live. He said the process was worth it for our leadership team. The process was worth it. So he spent a fair amount of time going through developing a discipleship pathway with his elders and leadership team. It was worth it. So hopefully, if you have not done this already with your leadership team, you'll find some ideas from today. You'll start that, and it will be worth it, like it was for Reg. If yours is in progress or in process, maybe you'll take something away today, go back to your team, you can develop it further, and it will be worth it. Here are a couple of things that are worth noting about discipleship pathways that they don't do. This is not the answer to everything as it relates to discipleship in your church. Discipleship pathways do not replace disciple-making relationships. Pathways are what churches and leadership teams do so that we can get all the people in our church moving in a direction. But when we look at the life and ministry of Jesus, he spent so much time with Peter, James, and John. Sometimes Andrew got included in that. And then it was the 12, and then the 72 and the 150. And everything you read on discipleship will tell you that one-on-one or small group relationships are the most transformative, powerful way to see people's lives change. So discipleship pathways do not replace disciple-making relationships. You'll see that in some of the research. One of the ways that Dave Holmes lives this out at Centerville Grace is he says, we say who's next, not what's next. A lot of times with a discipleship pathway, the question is, okay, I just finished that class. What's next? I just read that book. What's next? I just did that course. What's next? And Dave has trained his people to say, who's next? You have discipled this person. Now this person should disciple someone. Who's next? Not what's next. That's a great disclaimer. Here's something else. Discipleship pathways do not reflect the slow and spotty growth patterns of our faith. It's not like you just keep graduating to the next level in the Christian faith. All of a sudden, you hit suffering and you have to learn something new, and maybe you go back a few steps. You move and you go through a major life change. You have to pause and learn some new things again. And so, discipleship pathways a lot of times can look like you're just moving from new believer to mature believer to leader. That's not the way that real life works for most people in our church, including myself. And we want to be aware of that. Discipleship pathways do not resource always for marketplace ministry and holistic health. A lot of times, what discipleship pathways do is they give us a really great biblical foundation. They help us understand spiritual gifts, spiritual disciplines, some relational skills, but they don't necessarily tell us how to be a great boss in the business world or how to coach um, our local little league team and to do it in a Christian way, even if it's not through a Christian organization. And they don't always tell us how to manage our diet and practice exercise. So discipleship pathways do not resource for marketplace ministry and holistic health, typically. And one more of these, well, that was the last one of the what they don't do. Here's four things that discipleship pathways do. They integrate people into the church. Discipleship pathways, a lot of times, are a great way for church assimilation. A lot of times, it will be an outreach event that reaches a non believer, a new believer, a spiritual seeker. It brings them into the church. And then there's that introductory class about the church or the Christian faith. It's really good for integrating people in the church. And as I looked through the literature and the plans that a lot of churches have, the integration or assimilation was really strong. But discipleship pathways do emphasize Bible study and sanctification. And so a lot of what the churches are doing is they're setting a biblical foundation. They're helping people do theology. They're doing some apologetics. They're doing some leadership development. Along the lines, they're helping people discover spiritual gifts. They're helping people learn how to practice forgiveness. They're helping people pray like Jesus prayed. So they emphasize Bible study and sanctification. And I saw this in almost everybody's discipleship pathway. Here's another thing they do. They provide growth and engagement metrics. So this is good. If you want to know, are people actually on the discipleship pathway? You can see, are people showing up to the different courses that we're providing? Are people graduating to the next course? Are people part of our groups that are built for discipleship? Are people part of quads or triangles? I'll talk about those in a little bit. Or there was one church that had an innovative way of doing online learning, and you can actually track as they go through the different courses. So they provide growth and engagement metrics. You get to see, are people making progress? Lastly, discipleship pathways do develop new leaders. And one of the things that we're always looking for in our churches or ministries is, do we have ways to develop leaders? And sometimes that leadership development will be helping people grow so they can lead a group, and sometimes help them grow so they might step into a role like deacon or elder at our church. But you could see this consistently in almost all of the discipleship pathways, that they were developing new leaders. So that's a lot to swallow right away. I'm just throwing that out there to see, here are some common themes that we see. Here are a few things that are almost always going to be missing from discipleship pathways. It's not a silver bullet, doesn't answer all the questions. One-on-one relationships are essential. And no one that I talked to or looked at their materials said, we have it mastered. So if you're feeling that way, That's good. We're all a work in progress. What I wanted to do now is pivot and look more closely at some examples that I saw in each of the churches. So in the next set of slides, you're going to see four major things that I saw from the research. And in those areas of research, I'm going to have real life examples as some of these pastors or ministry leaders shared materials with me. And if there's anything that you see there that you like, ooh, I like that, reach out to me. I can connect you with that pastor. Some of them who might not be a pastor, it might be a director of discipleship. Some of them might be in this Zoom space here, but we really want to try to build some of these connections. So a next step for you might be, I got to go talk to Mark Trumbull because I really like what he put together here. And I saw him earlier here. So here's some common features that we saw in all of these. One, alliteration. I don't know what it is about pastoral training, but you can't do without it. So everybody, it seemed like, was alliterating. That's kind of a silly aside, but I'll show you how that worked. There was also a combination. Most of the discipleship pathways were putting together various elements to make people move forward. There's always an education piece. And then there's this idea of intensification. We want to raise the stakes for people and help people grow. So, common feature number one, alliteration. This is just the way that different churches articulated. So, Renew in Canada, they had these six that they said they want people, they want to take seekers, they want to help them stick, they want to help them study, learn to serve, share, and then that scales, meaning it goes to the next person. It's reproducible. Alliteration at Gulfview Grace was rescue. So this is discipleship pathways start with new believers or spiritual seekers. We want to renovate them. We want to grow them. We want to reflect so that that goes outward. And then we also saw up in Alaska, engage, establish, empower, and equip. So if you do not yet have a discipleship pathway and you want to know how most people do it, it might have some alliteration. It's not, it doesn't have to be. I just noticed that was a common theme. Now I'm going to move on to something a little more serious here. The next one was this combination piece. A lot of people, when it came to discipleship pathways, they had a map. Where are we starting? Where are we headed? And then they had a menu, meaning as you get to each different new stage, there's a variety of things that you can be involved with. So that's map and menu. There was this combination of institutional and organic pieces. So here's something that the church will do for you, but the organic element is here's how you're just going to live this out. It's part of the ethos of our church. So I'll give you examples of that. And then you also saw that there were growth tracks, some very deliberate growth tracks that the church would create. So if you need to grow in mental health, here's a course. But you also want people to be part of a group so that they're in relationships. So growth tracks and groups was a common combination that we saw. So a little more detail on those. Here's what we see from a couple of our churches. We have map and menu. Grace Church, this one was shared at conference. This is Bell Fountain Grace. I really love the way that they have illustrated their map for discipleship. It does start with the seeker, the unbeliever, and it moves toward mission and leadership. You can see that each of these different stages has courses, and it's just kind of hard to see. The font's really small, but reach out to the leaders of Bell Fountain Grace and you can get a hold of them and talk through this a little bit more detail with them. But you're developing their understanding of sexuality, of spiritual gifts. You're getting them connected to other people in the church, and eventually you're moving them toward leadership development or living on mission. So that's theirs. The other one that you see on there is our church, Leesburg Grace. And you can see that Sunday morning is central to what we're trying to do. And then Sunday morning from that, people flow into a situational pathway, a relational pathway, or a what I call a formational pathway where they're serving. And all of those things kind of circle back to feeding into Sunday morning, and it becomes this virtuous circle of worship together and then growth outside of that. All right. Let me go on to the next one here. We have institutional and organic. So Gulfview Grace has some way that they're taking people through some of their development. They have different classes that people will take. And once you finish a certain set of classes, you might graduate to, or just move to another set of classes. So you're exploring your Christian foundations, but then there's always a next step. So that's the institutional side, and they have many more details on that. But then if you go look at Journey Church, which is out in Pennsylvania, they're really pushing the one-on-one disciple making relationships and how those organic relationships, and when they talk about that regularly, and they do a training where they bring people together on Saturday and cast vision for that. They're going to keep pushing people, be part of this organic disciple making ethos of our church. And they'll give some ideas on how to live that out. Spend some time in prayer, spend some time with the word open. So that's another combination piece that we commonly see. Institutional, it's what the church is providing, and organic, it's how you're living it out during the week. And then tracks and groups, a couple examples of this. We have, and you'll see this one twice, Peninsula Grace in Alaska. They have an apprenticeship track. If you want like a deep dive 2-year process, you can become part of their apprenticeship track. And then we see at Community Grace, one of their things is get people involved in a group. You're going to grow, that's an orange, if you're in a group. And so they have a variety of groups that people can get involved in. Okay, so this is the combination that we see. Undergirding that combination is education. And you see in almost everybody's discipleship pathway that I looked at, setting a biblical foundation, helping people practice and understand spiritual disciplines, self-discovery. That's who am I? Who am I in Christ? What are my gifts? How do I practice discernment? And then ministry skills. How do I take my spiritual gifts and I benefit other people with that? Maybe leading a group, maybe reaching out in my community. But that content was consistent in all the discipleship pathways. But each discipleship pathway had a different way of delivering the education. So I wanted to just take a minute to look at the methodology that we see. The education methodology from these different churches included classes and courses, self-paced online modules, mentor-led, quads and triangles, and organic or one-on-one education. So I'm going to break these down again in further detail and show you a couple examples of how different churches lived this out. So here's an education methodology. One, Renew You. And I know that Renew Church used this especially during COVID, but it was a very deliberate plan. It was like 20 pages of how to take people when they are social distance and not meeting regularly through a series of courses that could be tracked. And once you finish one, you go to the next. They had so many resources that they put together, and then they put them online so that different people from their churches could track their progress. It was a really innovative way of doing discipleship. And even Grace Seminary right now is providing two things for us called Charis Academy. And one of those things is taking people through the our core beliefs that Inspire has put together in case you wanted to go through ordination. All right. So we have something at the Charis level. This is something that a local church did using Right Now Media and some of their other online databases. Maybe that's not for everybody. So here's another example, a mentor-led version of this. Mark has a real deliberate plan of taking people in his church through different content and materials, and all of the modules are outlined in learning objectives. And some of those might be done in groups, and some of them are assignments given to the learner, the disciple, and then they come back and report. And it's a mentor-led process. And again, some of this is in development, and some of this can be used for leadership development. But the plan here is a mentor-led. The pastor or leader provides resources, provides accountability, and helps people grow in their knowledge and understanding of the Bible and gifts and other things. Here's another example of how we deliver material, quads and triangles. So at our church, we use something called discipleship quads. It's highly relational. It's fairly organic. We get people in groups of four, and they often will study a Bible, look at a passage of scripture, and pray together. And we're just doing life on life disciple making. Some of our groups are reading through books, though. And one of the groups recently was reading through a Timothy Keller book and then processing it together. Another group was reading through a book on prayer and processing it together. And then you can see also that Peninsula Grace has something they do called triangles. And we have a detailed explanation on how they do triangles, but they spend time in prayer together and reading scripture together. And Justin has about a 20-page document, I think, that goes through their process and what they're doing with it. So quads and triangles is another delivery vehicle. So again, there's content, and then there's how these churches are delivering content. And then the last thing that I saw as a feature, if you're going to develop a discipleship pathway that is worth considering, is intensification. We want disciples to grow in maturity, to go deeper in their faith, and to reach out to other people. And so this idea of intensification is really important. So with intensification, there was often this language of what's the next step or what's the next stage? What's the next class or what's the next track? What's another level? Like apprenticeship is another level that you go with someone who is really going to develop. We have leadership development tracks that churches have. And then the hope is that this results in reproduction, disciples who are making disciples. And so a couple more examples. I've shown these already, but you can see the intensification of Bell Fountain Grace and how they're moving people from a special event all the way to living on mission. And each color takes you to another level of intensification. And I mentioned Peninsula Grace and their apprenticeship track. You can see that in 2025, they're starting something. This just started, I think, last week for them. And you're taking someone through a 2-year process of developing as an apprentice of Jesus who may end up being a leader at their church. So those are two examples of intensification, but you always want to keep moving people forward. So this is a lot of content to digest. I've scratched the surface and given you the main highlights. We can give you more of the material as long as I have permission from these different churches. They shared it with me. I'm sure they'd shared it with you, but I'd rather have you make a connection with them, and you can build this sort of ethos of disciple making and discipleship pathways. But I have some questions for you, and I'd love for you to discuss this in small groups. So what we're going to do is we're going to break out in a couple groups here, and here are the key questions that we will put in the chat group. One is, why should we develop a discipleship pathway? I wouldn't take as much time on that, but it's just a Kickstarter question. What's the cost if we don't develop a discipleship pathway? We know that Dallas Willard says the cost of non-discipleship is as great as the cost of discipleship. We also have, what does the discipleship pathway in your church look like? Here's a chance to share some things that you're doing. What can you draw from these examples? How do you take the 3 things discipleship pathways do not do and address them? And then what are 1 or 2 key takeaways from this webinar, or 1 or 2 next steps?